I'm David Cott, host of New History of Spain, and this is episode 4 titled Tartessos and the Phoenician and Greek Colonization. In this episode, I will explain everything you need to know about the early Iron Age in the Iberian Peninsula, a period characterized by Phoenician and Greek colonization and the mysterious Tartessian civilization. Early Iron Age in the Iberian Peninsula. Around 800 BC, the Iron Age began in the Iberian Peninsula. This era was marked by the introduction of iron, which people used to make longer-lasting agricultural tools and weapons. Iron has the advantage of being easier to find than copper or bronze. It's unclear who first brought these iron-working techniques, whether it was the Celts, the Phoenicians, or perhaps both, depending on the region. The early Iron Age, which lasted until about 550 BC, saw parts of the Iberian Peninsula enter what we call historical times. Along the Mediterranean and some Atlantic coasts, locals started using alphabets introduced through contacts with Phoenicians and Greeks from the Eastern Mediterranean. However, some regions, especially inland, remain in prehistory, not using writing nor having any foreign civilization write about these people. Moreover, we don't have any preserved or deciphered literary works or chronicles from the indigenous peoples themselves, only epigraphs or commercial contracts. This period, up to the Roman conquest, is often referred to as the protohistory of the Iberian Peninsula, because our written sources about native peoples come from outsiders. The Phoenician and Greek colonization were catalysts for sociocultural transformations among the indigenous communities of the Iberian Peninsula. Unlike the Roman Empire or European empires of the modern era, the Phoenicians and Greeks did not aim to control large territories, but to set up and secure trading routes. They created commercial and agricultural settlements through agreements with local populations. These relationships were usually mutually beneficial, focusing more on cooperation than on imposing foreign control and culture by force. From the 8th to the 6th centuries BC, the Mediterranean region was not a battleground for competing powers aiming to create exclusive areas for themselves. There was no clash of civilizations in the Western Mediterranean between Phoenicians and Greeks. Although the Phoenicians were the pioneers and most influential traders, they shared information and collaborated with the Greeks because they pursued private interests, not those of a state. Governed by multiple city-states rather than empires, both Phoenicians and Greeks preferred to establish trade posts in strategic coastal spots such as islets and cliffs by the sea, providing a good balance between proximity to indigenous communities and natural defenses. In the end, although the Phoenician and Greek colonization was marked by cooperation, conflicts sometimes occurred. Economic opportunities were what drove the Phoenicians and later the Greeks to travel and settle in the Iberian Peninsula. Trade and cultural interactions between Phoenicians, Greeks, and the Iberian indigenous communities deeply changed both the natives and the colonies, including the societies of their places of origin. Before the arrival of the Carthaginians and Romans, Iberia was a place without borders and with great cultural and social fluidity, resulting in hybrid cultural identities such as the Tartessian culture that we will study later in detail. Native elites acted as intermediaries in trade with foreigners. Therefore, colonial trade reinforced internal dynamics of social stratification and the emergence of dominant political lineages, and imported prestige goods helped to reinforce the social status of the elites. The influence of these Eastern Mediterranean traders led to increased exploitation of mines and more intensive agriculture, to produce something these traders desired in exchange for their exports. Phoenicians and Greeks introduced mining and agricultural techniques that boosted production to meet both local needs and the demands of trade. Notably, they introduced viticulture and olive cultivation in the Iberian Peninsula, though these crops did not become widespread until the Roman era. Wine, highly valued in ceremonies and social settings, began to be produced locally, reflecting a shift from import to local production, particularly after the 6th and 5th centuries BC. This shift occurred alongside a broader decline in imported goods, with many items previously brought from abroad starting to be made locally, often imitating Phoenician or Greek styles. Phoenicians in the Iberian Peninsula. Many people are familiar with the Greeks, but who were the Phoenicians and where did they come from? Phoenicia was located in the Levant, mostly in what's now Lebanon, extending into parts of modern-day Israel, Palestine, and Syria. By around 1200 BC, the Phoenicians emerged as Semitic peoples who shared a common language and alphabet, as well as religious, political, and economic practices. Phoenicia was a civilization renowned for its skilled seafarers and long-distance trade, and they played a key role in the development of alphabets, which were simpler and more practical than hieroglyphs or other ancient writing systems. Technically, the first alphabet was the Semitic Proto-Sinaitic script, which predates the Phoenician alphabet by some centuries, but most modern-day alphabets, including Greek, Latin, Mongolian, or Arabic, derive from the Phoenician alphabet. Phoenicia was not a unified nation, but a collection of independent city-states like Sidon, Tyre, Byblos, and Arwad. These cities often had to pay tributes to larger empires like the Neo-Assyrian Empire or Egypt. Each city-state was ruled by monarchs, who were seen as gods. The kings were not just rulers but also the leading merchants, using their fleets to open up new trading opportunities. Thus, the rulers of these states played a fundamental role in Phoenician colonization, although as their trade routes and colonies grew, the benefits increasingly spread beyond the royal families to the emerging class of wealthy traders and other citizens. By the 9th century BC, these changes helped form powerful urban oligarchies or bourgeoisie, who gained wealth through trade and started to act as a political counterbalance to the monarchy in assemblies. This shift led to political and social divisions within Phoenicia. The kings and landowners generally preferred to keep paying tributes to the Assyrians, while the rising merchant classes pushed for closer ties with Egypt to escape the heavy tributes that cut into their profits, because the Assyrians mainly demanded luxury products as tribute. Caught between the Assyrian and Egyptian empires, Phoenician city-states found themselves facing increased Assyrian interference in the 7th century BC, and the Assyrians violently suppressed revolts instigated by Egypt. The ongoing conflicts and shifting powers within Phoenicia saw the city-state of Tyre lose its control over other Phoenician cities, and amid these conflicts, Sidon was destroyed. These events forced many Phoenicians to migrate to their western colonies, notably in Carthage, and other places like Sardinia and the Iberian Peninsula. This migration helped to economically bolster these colonies while weakening the Phoenician cities in their homeland. Ironically, it wasn't until foreign powers threatened or conquered the Phoenician city-states, and it was too late, that a collective Phoenician identity began to emerge, similarly to what occurred in ancient Greece. Interestingly, the name Phoenician itself comes from the Greeks, who used it to describe these people known for producing and exporting purple dye and textiles of that color. So, when did the Phoenicians reach the Iberian Peninsula, and what drew them so far from home? They already had well-established sea routes and trading posts in places like Cyprus and Sardinia. It's likely from Sardinia that they first learned about the Iberian Peninsula. Their initial visits were mainly to explore the area's economic potential without setting up permanent settlements, a phase we refer to as pre-colonization. Historical texts, including the Bible's mention of Tartessos, hint that the Phoenicians might have arrived as early as the reign of King Hiram I of Tyre and the biblical kings David and Solomon in the 10th century BC. More concrete evidence such as Phoenician, Greek Euboean, Cypriot, and Sardinian ceramics has been found in Huelva dating back to around 900 BC. It's not clear if Huelva, in southwestern Iberia, can be considered a city back then, since most archaeological work there has only involved emergency digs, not systematic excavations. We do know, however, there were already well-established local settlements in the region, which might explain why the Phoenicians didn't set up a colony in Huelva itself. They were particularly interested in the southwestern Iberian Peninsula and the Strait of Gibraltar area, mainly for its rich metal resources like tin, gold, silver, copper, and lead. The local populations around Huelva had easy access to these valuable metals, thanks to nearby mines and the metal-rich Rio Tinto River. The elites from Huelva also had strong trade relationships with populations deeper inland and across the Atlantic. After years of fruitful commercial relationships with the populations of the Huelva, the Phoenicians decided to establish colonies close to, but not directly, in Huelva, opting for nearby areas that lacked previous settlements, like the Bay of Cádiz. Cádiz is regarded as the oldest continuously occupied city in Western Europe. Ancient geographers like Strabo initially suggested that the Phoenician colony of Gadir, modern-day Cádiz, was founded around 1100 BC. However, this date has been debunked based on archaeological findings showing that the earliest settlements date from the late 9th or early 8th century BC, so around the year 800 BC, about a century after the first interactions between the Phoenicians and the natives of the Huelva province. Back then, the Bay of Cádiz looked very different. Cádiz itself was an archipelago made up of islands called Ericeia and Cotinusa. Throughout the Phoenician and Roman periods, Cádiz was a city split by a canal that functioned as a harbor. By the 6th century BC, the city experienced significant growth, with many people moving to settle on the nearby mainland. Cádiz was founded by Phoenician colonists from Tyre, the same city that had founded Carthage only a few years prior. These early settlers chose this archipelago for its natural defenses, the absence of a native settlement, and excellent access for ships, making it an ideal spot near Huelva, which was of great interest to the Phoenicians. Cádiz played a crucial role as a cultural bridge and a pivotal trade hub, although it did not surpass Huelva in importance until the downfall of the Tartessian civilization in the 6th century BC. Initially, Cádiz started as a trading post and eventually grew into a full-fledged city. About 50 years after the Phoenicians first settled, we see a marked increase in Phoenician pottery, especially amphoras found in Huelva and other places, which confirmed the success of their colonial endeavors. Priests had a significant role in establishing these new colonies, since Phoenician temples acted as centers for business and financial dealings that ensured the legitimacy of commercial transactions, as they happened under the god's watch. For example, the temple of Melkart in Cádiz, dedicated to the Tyrian national god and protector of commerce and sailors, became a revered site. Melkart was especially important in the Phoenician colonies on the Iberian Peninsula, where he was worshipped by many settlers from Tyre. Interestingly, after the Romans took over, this worship of Melkart transitioned into the worship of the Greek demigod Heracles in Cádiz. Since we are discussing their religious practices, the Phoenicians were polytheistic and had varied religious costumes depending on the city-state. They were notably open to combining different religious practices when encountering new cultures, a practice known as religious syncretism. This adaptability is evident in how their deities often originated from Syrian, Palestinian, Mesopotamian, and Egyptian gods. Among the religious beliefs of the Phoenicians was the sacred nature of water, which was seen as purifying due to its scarcity in their homeland. This bears similarity to the ritual washing found later in Islam. Phoenicians usually didn't depict gods in their art, and they frequently used amulets in their daily life. As for the political organization of Phoenician colonies in the Iberian Peninsula, details are sparse due to the lack of Phoenician written records. However, looking at examples from Carthage and later information about Cádiz and other colonies, it looks like they didn't establish hereditary monarchies like those in their homeland. Instead, they were likely governed by judges and councils of elders. Over time, ties between Tyre and its Iberian colonies weakened, and they gained complete political independence. After founding Cádiz, the Phoenicians went on to set up other colonies, including Málaga, Ibiza, Almuñécar in Granada, and Villaricos in Almería. Their settlements stretched from the Valencian community and the Balearic Islands all the way to Portugal, primarily along the estuaries of the Tagus and Mondego rivers. In Lisbon, discoveries of stelae and other Phoenician artifacts have sparked ongoing debates about whether the Phoenicians may have founded the capital of Portugal. However, considering its strategic location, it's likely that a native settlement was already present. Evidence of Phoenician trade has even been found in the Canary Islands, so imagine how far the ships and goods of these Semites reached. The settlements varied. Some were predominantly or exclusively Phoenician, while others were mixed communities with predominantly indigenous populations that included some Phoenician settlers. This interaction between the Phoenicians and the local people led to the development of the Tartessian culture, as we will see later in greater detail. Moreover, in the 7th and 6th centuries BC, as many Phoenicians moved westward for the crisis back home, they began farming more inland areas, founding mixed settlements like Carmona in Seville. In La Rábita of Guardamar del Segura, Alicante, researchers have concluded that Phoenician traders established a colony at the mouth of the Segura River, drawing in the local population and creating a culturally mixed community. The architecture and city planning in these colonies typically followed Phoenician styles, but local influences, particularly in pottery, remained strong. Over time, these influences blended so seamlessly that it became difficult to tell them apart. This blending of cultures suggests a deep level of cultural hybridization that impacted both the natives and the Phoenicians. Regarding the end of the archaic Phoenician era, I have already mentioned how Phoenician city-states eventually fell, first to the Neo-Babylonian Empire and later to the Persian Empire in the 6th century BC. This turmoil pushed many Phoenicians toward their western colonies, and that significantly changed the political and economic landscape of the Iberian Peninsula and the Mediterranean as a whole. Carthage, in particular, thrived during this time due to its diversified sources of wealth, allowing it to emerge as a new military and economic powerhouse in the Mediterranean. Carthage wasn't heavily affected by the declining demand from the Phoenician homeland and managed to bring other western Phoenician colonies under its influence. During the 6th century BC, the Iberian Peninsula underwent a significant territorial reorganization, as many small Phoenician trading posts disappeared in favor of larger, more dynamic cities, a process that also occurred among native communities. Cadiz itself evolved from a city known primarily for metal and luxury goods trade to one focused on maritime resources like fishing, salt production, and ceramics. This shift in the local economy marked Cadiz's transition from a trading post to a city-state, continuing the legacy left by the Tartessian city of Huelva and adapting to the new economic reality. Tartessos and the Tartessians. What exactly was Tartessos? Some search for it tirelessly, as if it were a mythical lost city, as if it was a Western Troy. Others hypothesize that the fall of Tartessos inspired Plato while writing about the myth of Atlantis. But fantasies aside, scientific research has removed much of the mysterious aura surrounding the Tartessian civilization. Tartessos was an indigenous civilization of the Iberian southwest that was heavily influenced by the Phoenicians, since trade and the settlement of the Phoenician people implied an exchange of ideas, beliefs, and costumes. This hybrid culture flourished from the 8th to the 5th century BC. Originally, Tartessos was concentrated on the southwestern coast, between Huelva and the estuaries of the Guadalquivir and Guadiana rivers, extending up to the Bay of Cadiz. However, as the Phoenicians' influence deepened and that created a hybrid culture through contacts and intermarriage with the natives, Tartessian culture gradually spread farther inland, reaching as far as the Guadiana River in Extremadura by the 7th century BC. It's important to note that this was not a culturally uniform area. The impact of Phoenician influence varied greatly across different regions, and there was also no single indigenous culture before the Phoenicians arrived. Some of our knowledge about Tartessos comes from ancient texts. It's widely accepted that the region called Tartessos in the Old Testament refers to Tartessos, described as a vital trading hub for the Phoenicians, linked to the city-state of Tyre and celebrated for its abundant precious metals. This description perfectly matches what we know about Tartessos. The Old Testament states, quote, "The king had a fleet of trading ships manned by Hiram's servants. Once every 3 years it returned, carrying gold, silver, ivory, apes, and baboons." End quote. The book of Ezekiel mentions, quote, "Tarshish did business with you, Tyre, because of your great wealth of goods. They exchanged silver, iron, tin, and lead for your merchandise." End quote. Moreover, ancient silver from the southwestern Iberian Peninsula was found in Israel, and some Greek pottery references silver from Tarshish. The first Greek literary reference about Tartessos is from the 7th century BC, and describes it not as a city but as a river, identified with the Guadalquivir that flows through cities like Córdoba and Seville. Later, Greeks associated Tartessos with the southwest of Iberia, renowned for being rich in precious metals. Notable historians like Herodotus documented its trade and cultural exchanges with the Phoenicians and Greeks from the city-state of Phocia, located in western Anatolia. Much intrigue surrounds a Tartessian king who supposedly lived 120 years, named Arganthonios, whom the Greeks might have labeled to associate the wealth of Tartessos with silver. Whether he was a real king, a symbolic figure who never existed, or a dynasty given the longevity attributed to him remains unclear. What is important to note is that there is no evidence that a unified Tartessian kingdom or empire ever existed. There are no signs of widespread violence or of a warrior society in archaeology, and a biblical passage suggests that there were multiple kings in Tartessos. That makes a lot of sense given that the archaic Mediterranean wall was one of city-states, not kingdoms or empires. Despite the lack of a centralized political entity, the Tartessian civilization can be seen as culturally and economically integrated. But back to my point, it's interesting that Arganthonios reportedly offered the Greek Phocians a chance to settle in his domains. When they declined, he instead provided them with gold to fortify Phocia, their homeland, against external threats. Aside from being one of the very few things we know about the political history of Tartessos, this is interesting because archaeologists have documented a large walled enclosure in Phocia that spanned 5 to 8 kilometers and was built between 600 and 580 BC. Additionally, a sanctuary dedicated to a goddess was also uncovered. The wealth generated from the gifts and trade with Tartessos likely funded these significant constructions shortly before Phocia fell into Persian hands. Where might King Arganthonios have ruled? It is uncertain, but it's plausible he could have governed Huelva. Thanks to its advantageous location at the mouth of the Tinto and Odiel rivers and access to mineral resources, Huelva became a key urban center and the most important city of the Tartessian civilization. It held greater political and economic influence than Cadiz until the 6th century BC, when the core of Tartessos faced a major crisis. The praised wealth of Tartessos largely stemmed from the Rio Tinto River and the mines of Sierra Morena. The Phoenicians introduced advanced techniques for extracting and processing silver, which significantly boosted production. Although they adopted these new methods, it was the local Tartessian elites who controlled the mining and transportation of materials, with the Phoenicians mainly handling the export of tin, gold, silver, and copper. This arrangement provided highly beneficial for both sides. The trade also drew other Iberian peoples to the area, as archaeologists have observed a population increase and the rise of numerous new cities following the early Phoenician colonization. The association of Tartessos with wealth suggests it likely had a highly unequal society, similar to other ancient cultures such as the Argaric culture we studied in episode 3, Prehistory of the Iberian Peninsula. It's possible, and even likely, that some form of servitude or slavery existed, particularly in mining. However, the Tartessian economy was diverse. Besides mining, livestock also played a significant role, with herding and breeding of sheep, goats, pigs, and poultry being prominent activities. It is odd to see how pork consumption increased among Tartessians, despite the Phoenician dislike for pork, as it happened to other Semitic peoples, which highlights how they were a distinct and hybrid culture and not just an Iberian copycat of the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians also left a mark on Tartessian pottery and agriculture. They introduced new farming techniques and crops such as vines, olives, and some legumes and fruit trees, which thrived in the fertile soils of the Guadalquivir Valley of Andalusia. Settlements like Carmona exemplify how indigenous and Phoenician communities worked together to cultivate these lands more effectively. This collaboration showcases the broader impact of Phoenician presence that extended beyond trade and metallurgy. Moving on to religion, the Tartessians embraced several Phoenician deities, including Melkart, Astarte, and Baal. Among these, Astarte, a mother goddess from Mesopotamia who symbolized nature, life, love, and fertility, was particularly revered, even more so than Melkart. Baal, associated with the weather, was linked to the prosperity of agriculture and was often depicted as a bull. Tartessian religious practices were heavily influenced by the Phoenicians. The Tartessians usually followed the funerary rite of cremation, and their temples served both as places of worship and as hubs for social meetings and trade. Initially, Tartessian temples closely mimicked Phoenician designs, but over time, they developed some unique architectural features. But the Tartessian civilization experienced an abrupt halt in development between 575 and 550 BC. The core of Tartessos along the Atlantic Andalusian coast experienced a sudden crisis. In one fell swoop, numerous urban centers disappeared, including the largest Tartessian city, Huelva. Researchers have looked for gradual causes for Tartessos' decline, from the depletion of cheaply extractable local mineral resources to broader geopolitical instability, including the fall of Phoenicia and troubles faced by the Greek Phocians. However, these factors alone cannot fully explain the sudden disappearance of coastal settlements, while inland areas either remained stable or grew. The truth behind the collapse of the core of Tartessos? None other than a devastating earthquake followed by a tsunami, according to the most recent geological and archaeological research. This natural disaster truncated the cultural and economic development of Tartessos. Despite this catastrophe, Tartessian culture did not disappear entirely. In regions close to the coasts, the social structure, material culture, and economic systems evolved, giving rise to the Turdetanian culture, which continued many Tartessian traditions. Some Tartessians relocated farther inland, or to other areas, such as near the mouth of the Tagus River in what's now Lisbon, or in the Middle Guadiana Valley in the province of Badajoz in Extremadura. The Middle Guadiana Valley had been a peripheral region of the Tartessian civilization. Nonetheless, as many Tartessians moved from the coast of Huelva to this area, the Tartessian culture was able to survive without significant changes in architecture, art, religious practices, or burial customs for about another 150 years, until the end of the 5th century BC. New settlements emerged, such as Medellin, the birthplace of Hernán Cortés, and rural estates like the sanctuary of Canchorroano or the spectacular house of El Turuñuelo. El Turuñuelo, in particular, showcased advanced construction techniques for its time, such as parts built with lime mortar and a brick vault, which were previously thought to be innovations of the Roman era. The site of Casas del Turuñuelo also revealed a staircase leading to a courtyard with a ball-height-shaped altar. And last year, researchers discovered reliefs depicting human faces, possibly representing deities or prominent Tartessian figures. At the El Turuñuelo site, archaeologists uncovered a marble sculpture made with materials from Mount Pentelicus near Athens, Greece, painted with a pigment known as Egyptian blue. They also found Etruscan ivories and glass bowls from Macedonia and other Eastern Mediterranean regions. The story that all these artifacts tell us is that the Tartessian civilization was well connected to the international trade networks of its time. They also found at Casas del Truñuelo more than 50 sacrificed animals, most of them being horses and arranged in a somewhat theatrical manner. El Truñuelo hasn't yet been fully excavated, and every year they make discoveries, so our understanding of Tartessos continues to evolve. El Truñuelo and Can Chorroano are among over 1,000 buildings found along the Guadiana River hidden beneath mounds. This preservation method has kept them in excellent condition for archaeologists. But why were they hidden? Well, again, Tartessos faced a dramatic natural catastrophe around 400 BC. An extraordinary rise in the Guadiana River, which historically occurred every 500 years, before its course became highly regulated by reservoirs. So there was no invasion of Celts, as some hypothesized, because the Tartessians wouldn't have wasted so much time hiding their buildings if their lives were in danger. Most Tartessian buildings in the Guadiana Valley were located next to the river, close enough to benefit from the rivers, but far enough to avoid suffering from regular floods. But while regular floods, every 10 years for instance, were predictable and manageable, no one could prepare for a rare massive flood. The problem was not so much that the buildings themselves were affected by the floods, which they were, but the biggest problem was the surrounding farming lands, which became unusable for years. This explains why the local Tartessians could spend days conducting elaborate rituals to conceal their buildings. They held large feasts, performed numerous animal sacrifices, and then set the buildings on fire. Many people needed to be mobilized to fill the monumental buildings with soil. Once filled, the Tartessians offered drinks to deities by pouring a drink. That's why archaeologists have found luxury cups on the mound surfaces. The buildings were then sealed with a clay layer. Given the thoroughness of this sealing process, I cannot avoid wondering if the Tartessians hoped to return to their lands once they became suitable for farming again. But if that was the case, then it would be difficult to explain why they set the buildings on fire. In short, there is still much mystery around why they put so much effort into hiding their buildings. And it remains a mystery where these Tartessians went after abandoning their properties. Likely they sought new lands to cultivate, perhaps this time not so close to a river. The collapses of Tartessian civilization are a reminder of nature's dual role as nurturer and destroyer, since Tartessos succumbed twice to the relentless wrath of water. Greeks in the Iberian Peninsula. The civilization of ancient Greece extended beyond present-day Greece and part of Albania, reaching across to the coasts of Asia Minor, or what is now known as Anatolia. From these regions, the Greeks ventured out, establishing colonies along the Black Sea coast, throughout Cyprus and Sicily, in southern Italy, and even as far as the Gulf of Lyon, in southern France. In the Iberian Peninsula, which they called Iberia, the Greeks' approach was quite similar to the Phoenicians, though they started later and on a smaller scale. The Greeks mainly acted as middlemen, trading products like ceramics, wine, oil, and perfumes in exchange for metals, cereals, flax, esparto, and salted fish from the native Iberians. Unlike the Phoenicians, the Greeks spent much more time in what we might call the pre-colonization phase, meaning they came to the Iberian Peninsula occasionally without setting up permanent settlements. Historian Adolfo Jerónimo Domínguez Monedero and others have suggested that Greeks from Euboea, an island in central Greece, were possibly the first to trade in the Iberian Peninsula. The Euboeans had already established colonies in Sicily, so it would not be far-fetched to imagine them making some voyages to Iberia. Just as in the Eastern Mediterranean, they also used routes frequented by the Phoenicians, and it is possible that there were some joint ventures between Phoenicians and Greek merchants. Evidence from the names of certain Iberian cities and the oldest Greek ceramics found in Huelva from around the late 10th or early 9th century BC, which are Euboean in origin, supports this theory. There could be other explanations, but it just makes sense that Greek merchants visited the Iberian southwest looking for the wealth of Tartessos in such an early period. While the Euboean presence is more uncertain, we can trace the journeys and settlements of Samians and Phocians from the Anatolian coasts through both literary and archaeological records. Ionian Greeks, particularly from the city-state of Phocia and its colony Massalia, now Marseille in France, had many economic interests in the west. Their interactions with the Tartessian civilization are evident in historical accounts of King Argantonius and in archaeological finds in the city of Huelva. These encounters inspired epic poems and fables that depicted the far western edge of the known world as a mysterious, resource-rich land governed by wise and long-lived men. The Phoenician city of Malaga was especially important in the trade of Greek goods, which again reinforces the thesis of a cooperative relationship between Phoenicians and Greeks rather than a fierce clash of civilizations. Following these trade interactions between 580 and 560 BC, Phocian Greeks from Massalia founded Emporion, now known as Ampurias, in eastern Catalonia. Initially established as an emporion, meaning a trading post, it was primarily focused on commerce without significant agricultural activities. Emporion served to extend the trade networks of Phocia and Massalia, facilitating trade with nearby natives and acting as a staging point for further explorations southward in the peninsula. The transition of Emporion from a mere trading post to a polis, a fully fledged city-state with its own walls, agricultural land, currency, and government, is still debated by historians, but by the 5th century BC, it can be undoubtedly recognized as a polis. The first settlement of Ampurias, known as Palaiopolis, covered an area of 3 hectares and was built over an older indigenous Iron Age settlement. Archaeological findings from recent decades show that this early settlement had already imported materials of Phoenician, Etruscan, and Greek origins, likely through Greek traders acting as intermediaries. This interaction occurred a few decades before Ampurias itself was founded by the Greeks. By the second quarter of the 6th century BC, a significant shift occurred with the establishment of the Greek colony, which marked a clear break from its indigenous past. The exact terms under which the Greeks settled there remain unknown. They may have arrived through an agreement with the local inhabitants or by more forceful means. However, evidence of prior trade suggests that there was likely collaboration and coexistence between the Greeks and the indigenous people, since the Greeks' ultimate goal was to sell their products to Iberians. Following the Greek arrival, there was a notable increase in imported materials, advancements in building techniques, and a greater structuration of the settlement, and new artisanal activities. Yet, archaeologists believe that there were houses and objects clearly of indigenous tradition between the late 6th and the entire 5th century BC. Therefore, the cultural integration process took longer and was much more complex than written sources conveyed, and the identity of Ampurias during its early years was likely a mix of Greek and local elements, before the Greek element became the dominant one. Today, Palaiopolis is part of the town of San Martí d'Ampurias, which was the capital of the county of Ampurias until the 11th century. Originally, this area was a promontory or cape connected to the mainland by a narrow isthmus. Over centuries, sedimentation has fully attached it to the mainland, along with the old natural harbor at the mouth of the Ter and Fluvia rivers. Aside from that, the location of the settlement wasn't particularly interesting, since for instance the natural harbor was merely a shallow cove exposed to northern winds. A few years after establishing Palaiopolis, the Greeks founded Neapolis, a slightly larger urban area just south of the harbor, which has been extensively excavated and studied. With this expansion, Emporion became a twin city. The Emporitans were the first to mint coins in the Iberian Peninsula, producing silver coins inspired by those from the Greek colony of Syracuse in Sicily. These coins not only circulated throughout the Iberian Peninsula and southern Gaul, now France, but were also imitated by others, something that reflects the importance of empurias in trade at that time. Despite the prevalence of these coins across Catalonia and other regions like the Valencian coast, the Balearic Islands, and even as far as Andalusia and Extremadura, the full extent of their circulation is hard to determine. This difficulty is due to the actions of detectorists, looters, and private collectors, which have left many coins undocumented or found without proper archaeological context. That is why I ask you to please not support in any way metal detectorists, because usually their activities cause irreparable harm to heritage sites and our scientific knowledge of history. Centuries after establishing Emporion, the Greeks founded a small settlement named Rhodes, now known as Roses, located in the same Gulf of Roses as Empúries, in eastern Catalonia. Compared to Emporion, Rhodes has fewer archaeological remains and has not been as extensively studied. However, the Greek colony of Rhodes enjoyed a brief period of enough political and economic autonomy to mint its own coins. Beyond Emporion and Rhodes, there are no records of more Greek colonies in the Iberian Peninsula. Greek Emporias didn't just grow due to its economic success. Political shifts played a significant role too. Following the Persian conquest of their homeland Phocia and a naval defeat by the Carthaginians and Etruscans, many Phocians fled to Massalia, Emporion, and other western colonies. These colonies adapted by expanding what were mainly trade centers to full-fledged settlements with substantial agricultural activities. The new political situation also forced Phocians to trade goods from Italy and the western Greek colonies rather than from the east, which is very similar to what happened to Western Phoenicians when Phoenicia declined. By the 5th century BC, Emporion had become a well-fortified settlement, reflecting an increased distrust and exclusion from the neighboring native communities. According to the ancient geographer Strabo, by the 4th century BC, Emporion had developed a distinct urban area inhabited by locals, but physically separated the Greek inhabitants from the indigenous people with a wall. As the power of Empúries grew, nearby indigenous peoples started to imitate their Greek culture, much like the impact Phoenician colonies had on native cultures and particularly in the emergence of Tartessos. A good example is Ullastret, a native settlement close to Emporion which saw significant growth in the 4th and 3rd centuries BC. Ullastret began to incorporate Greek-style urban planning and architecture. The Iberians of present-day Catalonia adopted Greek cultural elements, including art styles, writing, and architectural techniques, and became acquainted with Greek legal and contractual systems. However, Greek culture did not overshadow indigenous traditions, but instead influenced them. As the Tartessian civilization collapsed in the southwestern coast of the Iberian Peninsula, the Greeks shifted their commercial focus eastward to the Levantine coast, particularly towards the mining districts of Jaén, Andalusia, accessible from the Segura River. By the 5th or 4th century BC, this shift led to a noticeable increase in Greek cultural influences in Jaén. Local chieftains built statues and erected monuments, developing a rich iconography to honor and elevate to a mythical status of heroes some Iberian elites. The Greek influence could penetrate to the interior of Upper Andalusia because Greek traders frequented the coasts of the region of Valencia. One of the places they visited often was the settlement of La Picola in Santa Pola, Alicante, a settlement structured with regular parallel streets like those of Greek cities. La Picola thrived for a little over a century, from 450 to 330 BC, and it was originally established as a trading post by the Iberians of the nearby settlement of Elche. La Picola occasionally hosted Greek merchants who passed through or traded in the region, so it was mainly a commercial hub for the redistribution of Greek goods in eastern Iberia. This interaction necessitated a way to document agreements and transactions between the Greek merchants and the local communities, and that led to the emergence of the Greco-Iberian alphabet in the region. Over time, Greek ceramics and other goods became highly sought after by local Iberians. Greek vases, for instance, were not used in regular meals as in Greece. Instead, they were considered prestige goods that were used in selected social occasions and in funerary rites. This is similar to how Coca-Cola is an everyday product in the United States, whereas a few years ago at least, Coca-Cola in Kenya was considered a luxury drink reserved for social gatherings and to welcome guests. What I mean by this example is that products can acquire different meanings and practices than originally conceived once they cross borders. And in some ways, rather than Hellenizing the Iberians, Greek products became Iberized. They were adapted to the needs of the Iberian native communities. But going back to Eastern Catalonia, Empúries continued to grow, particularly in the 2nd century BC. The alliance with Rome brought significant wealth to the city, allowing for major urban developments in Emporion, including an artificial harbor and a new central square, a Greek agora. These enhancements cemented Emporion's status as a key economic and cultural hub in the region. I will talk more about Emporion and the Greek influence in the Iberian Peninsula in the following episodes, as I discuss the pre-Roman peoples of Iberia and the Roman conquest and administration.
The verdict.
Today's The Verdict celebrates the Phoenician heritage and influence on the Iberian Peninsula that has too often been overlooked. Due to narratives favored by European nationalisms, and specifically in Spain, the foundations of the so-called Western civilization are frequently attributed solely to Greece and Rome. Such narratives tend to dismiss contributions from other cultures, like those of Al-Andalus or Semitic peoples like the Phoenicians. In reality, during the Archaic period, the Phoenicians exerted a more substantial influence on the Iberian Peninsula than the Greeks. They introduced the alphabet, wine, and olive oil, and played a critical role in the development of the Tartessian civilization. So thank you, Phoenicians, for all the good things you brought. And with that, the verdict ends. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to my YouTube channel and podcast New History of Spain. If you love my content, please consider becoming a Patreon at patreon.com/newhistoryspain, where you can get exclusive perks such as early access to all my content. You can also follow the show on Twitter or join the Discord server to stay updated, and you can find the link to my English to Spanish translation service on Fiverr in the episode's description. In the next episode, I will talk about the pre-Roman peoples of the Iberian Peninsula. Thank you very much for your attention and see you next time.